And we're live.
Good evening, everybody. We have, we have our history stream. First of all, hello, everyone. May you be male, female, or whatever hell you want to call yourself. And tonight, MC will be talking about a lovely gentleman who is well known for his best friends with, I believe it was a Hamilton fellow, and he was rather friendly with certain members of his slaves. I think I'll leave that there and hand it over to MC now. All yours, sir.
Yes, we're going to talk about the probably the most controversial, founding father, and in a lot of different contexts. Okay, so that people can understand who this man was. All right, what he was. He's not the monster everyone claims that he is. He's a man of his time, and he's a man out of his time. He was a man who was a visionary, and yet he was also a product of the world that he grew up in and the world that was around him. Right? Thomas Jefferson was born in Virginia. He was born to a well-off family. The family, his father had, when he was born, owned approximately 60 slaves, which he willed to him later on. He was the eldest of the boys. All right. His mother. There are people who believe that he was estranged from his mother. I don't really know if that's an accurate assessment. The reason people believe that has to do more with the fact that his mother isn't very much mentioned in his memoirs, right? And his writings. He doesn't really seem to be talking to his mother a whole lot. But then again, when you're talking about somebody that's born, and I'm going to reuse this term, and I want people to understand this. This man was born as an aristocrat in America. He wasn't part of the quote unquote, British aristocracy. Okay. But from an American standpoint, he was aristocratic. He was one of these people that was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. In his memoirs, he relates that his earliest memories of when he's 3 years old is being carried by one of the house slaves. All right, being wrapped up and carried by one of his house slaves. That's one of his first memories from back in those days. All right, he was formally educated. Okay, he played and practiced the violin as he grew older, 3 hours a day. He would work on his studies another 6 to 12 hours a day, right? And he spent like 6 to 8 hours sleeping, and that was it. Eating and sleeping, right? Constantly on the move. He then, as a young man, did something that most people at that time frame didn't do early on, and that is he went into politics. Now, he himself was a kind of a shy individual, all right, on an individual basis. But he wasn't shy necessarily about his opinions, just that he had that mindset. You know that gentlemanly mindset that overlays a lot of the British aristocracy?
No idea. Never seen it before.
He was a part of that. They were part of trying to emulate that in America, right? He was the landed gentry, right? He really looked at the world that way, and this is the world that he grew up in, right? And but when he went into politics in the basically beginning in getting elected as a Burgess, right, and going to the assembly in Virginia. All right. He himself, once again, made no grandiose speeches that people followed. He wasn't the firebrand, all right, that Patrick Henry was, right? He wasn't going to go out there and give that speech, that demagogic speech. Okay. But he was somebody that was well trained. He was somebody that was well spoken. And he was someone that could write. And one of the first things that he writes is actually this. All right. And what is this? This is a summary view of the rights of British America. Okay. And it's not too long. I mean, it's just an entire page. It's kind of like a little essay / pamphlet if you really want to go back to what this was referring to, right? And read it for yourself. And most people, even in America, have never even heard of this. Right? They just don't understand the context of this. All right. And we probably should put that in a link for that in the description. I'll give it to you later, so if you can put it on there. All right.
No problem.
I should have thought about that a little earlier. But the summary goes into detail about something that I've tried to explain to people about the American colonists. All right. The American colonists believed they had loyalty and they owed fidelity not to Britain, but to the king. They were his subjects, not Parliament's subjects. They were the king's subjects. People forget when the American colonies were founded, they were done so from charters from the king. There was no grand, well, Parliament's going to give you 500, guilders to or whatever you call them, pounds or whatever they use. Parliament wasn't sending ships to America, right, to create the colonies. They were being chartered by private enterprises that would make a deal and get issued a charter to do so from the king. At no point in the initial founding colonies do you see anybody dipping into the quote unquote royal treasury, right? All they were being given is that, yeah, okay, we recognize this. You guys go do what you want. We'll give you a chance to go sit up there and make a name for yourselves. And the colonies did. And Parliament, for the most part, this is something else that's very important too. Parliament didn't regulate the colonies because they couldn't. And what I mean by that is the day-to-day operations and the day-to-day goings-on that were going on in the colonies couldn't be handled or couldn't even be talked about from the British, the British Parliament, simply because it was too far away. You were never going to have the ability to do that. Okay, so the colonies were left on their own, and they were left as trading partners then with the British, right? And it's only when the British Empire is at war with France, specifically in the 1700s, the 1760s and late 50s, early 60s, that the Royal Treasury or the British Treasury is used in the defense of the colonies, but really it was to make war against the enemies of Britain as a whole. And you can't ignore that. But at the same time, the Americans look at it as, the American colonists are looking at it, yeah, we're at war because we're part of the British thing, but what are we really getting from the empire that we need? All right, so that when these taxes start getting leveled against the colonists, right, that's when people start going, wait a minute, you don't have the authority. We don't recognize Parliament's authority to level taxes on us. Our charters and our loyalty is to the king and the king only. And as the king sided more and more with Parliament, the American colonists were like, well, he's being disloyal to us. All right. Our fidelity is to the king, but look at what he's doing to us. Right. He's basically selling us out. And that's what the summation basically comes across. A lot of people, they really don't understand the view of the American colonists, right? And this was one of the more important essays that got that got written about when he wrote it. Now, what's interesting is when he wrote this basically for Virginia, and it gets published and spread around, right? And it makes Jefferson a known quantity. Okay, it makes his name known, all right, throughout the entire 13 colonies. He is no longer just a regional person. He's now being known, outside of this as well. And this notoriety bothers him. All right, it really does. And one of the things that he does is he tries to head back, all right, and in divorce himself, at least temporarily, get out of the limelight, right? Temporarily, right? And he designs Monticello, right? Which is everybody's seen this, right? He designs this grand mansion for himself, right, on the acres. He has married a very wealthy widow. It increases his holdings both in land and slaves by 2 to 3 fold, right? Just from her dowry, right? And that's another thing. We don't often talk about dowries today because it's ignored, right? We don't look at it. But back then, if you were a woman marrying, you had to provide. In many cases in this old world, you had to provide. You're taking the woman into your household, all right, and therefore she had to bring something with her, right? This was the standard practice at the time, right? Her name is coincidentally Martha. All right. He goes on to be selected as one of the representatives to the obviously to the Continental Congress, and he's on the committee, all right, that is charged with writing the Declaration of Independence. Now, we talk about Thomas Jefferson as the author of the document, and at the time frame, actually, there were several people that were upset about this, not the least of which is John Adams. Right, who is on the committee with him, right? But because they come back and they say, well, we made edits to this, and this was part of our, it wasn't just written by a single individual, which is technically true. There were edits, there were things that were designed, but for the most part, almost the entire document is written by them. And the whole document of, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal. Okay. Well, then, why do you have slaves? Okay. How was this? And the thing about slavery and the institution of slavery, right, is it damaged not just the slaves, all right, it damaged the slave owners and trapped them into a very narrow view of the world. Thomas Jefferson has several children with Martha, a couple of which are daughters, right? His oldest daughter is also named Martha. He calls her Patsy. Just obviously to make things a little bit easier in the household, you oftentimes use either a nickname or the middle name for when the parents. Many times, children are named by the parents, but then referred to by their middle names by the internal families, right?
Yeah.
So, but he was of course very protective of her, and yet and his children, but at the same time he was also very, very strict, right? He tries to put them in a convent, puts them in a convent for a while, right? Because to make sure that they have the proper upbringing and womanly virtues, right? very. If you want to really look at one of the things that he was uh, known for, right? All right, at the time, he was when they talk about the patriarchy, he was a living symbol of the patriarchy in that regard. He is selected, all right, after the war, all right, to be the representative, right, to replace Franklin, right, as the representative of France. And while he's in France, you know, touring and going and being the ambassador and all the things with it and having these lavish lifestyles and viewing the arts and all the food, he's writing back to the Americans and telling them, don't come here because you don't want to live a life of hedonism. Right. And it's like, okay, so more of the do as I say, not as I do, but he's looking at it through a lens. He can't see his own hypocrisy in this regard. You got to understand this. He himself can afford this ridiculous, lavish lifestyle. He has wealth at the wazoo, right? But most Americans don't, right? So he's imploring them to not go down this road because unless you basically have the money, right?
Yeah.
Unless you're part of his class, he doesn't. He recognizes that the individuals have to be individuals, but at the same time, he's putting himself in a status above other Americans, regardless of their color, right? Initially, right, or even. I shouldn't say initially, period, right? He always looked at himself as being the gentleman aristocrat, and he hated. This is something most people don't know. He hated the artisan classes. He hated industrialization, right? He believed that America should always remain an agrarian society. That it shouldn't industrialize, that it shouldn't go into these buildings and things. That the true goal should be for you to live on a farm and be a farmer, right? So he's a complicated individual mentally because internally these contradictions exist. Now, during the Revolutionary War, at one point, the British in the 1780 invade Virginia. Right? What does he do? He runs. Right? Well, this is another thing about the man. The people they look at Thomas Jefferson and they talk about his works in words, but when it came to himself, did he stand and fight the British? No. Did he go and join the Continental Congress, Continental Army? No. All right. And you can't use it with him. You can't use the excuse, well, he was an old man. What do you expect? Right. He wasn't one of these people now the thing that most people don't know about him also is the fact that he wasn't a robust individual. You see this picture of him, but the reality is the man himself was somewhat frail. Okay, constitutionally, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So even though he was, go ahead. You want to ask a question?
I have to say, I do feel the urge to point out maybe he should change his name to Sir Robin. After all, he did run away.
He did and people pointed this out and he was very upset about it. When his wife dies, right, later on, he is very upset and he actually closes himself off from everything to go back to being on at Monticello and focusing on Monticello. And everyone talks about Monticello as this great architectural wonder. Okay, yeah. I mean, for the time period it was built, yeah. Okay, I can see why you would say, "Look at this mansion; it's impressive." I can understand all that, but at the same time, was there anything really novel? All right, worldwide and earth shattering? No. Was he able to do things that other people hadn't seen in America before? Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's very true, and he was renowned from that perspective. Okay, but was he was he Frank Lloyd Wright? No. Okay, but he could write. But the one thing he could do is he was an author, and he did read and write extensively, right? And so the man, of course, kept slaves, and he fathered several children, all right, with a slave named Sally Hensley. I think I'm pronouncing it right. I could be mispronouncing it. Right now, Sally was a slave in his household who herself was born from a female black slave and a white father. Okay, so she was considered back in the term of that time frame was a mulatto. Okay,
Mhm.
now why is this important? Well, it's important because it shows the hypocrisy of the individual. Right, it shows the fact that here he is fathering children with slaves. Okay, now did he love Sally? Was he in love with Sally? It doesn't matter in the context of, okay, if you're looking at this from a patriarchal standpoint, whereas your slaves are like your children, then you have to accept the fact that you're sleeping with your child, right? Then you have to accept the fact that you're breaking the father child bond into something else, even if it's not someone that's directly related to you, right? Is this something that you should be doing? And his own viewpoints, which he expresses in his letters, is that he believes black people to be inferior. He believes them to be childlike. Okay, now, so and he writes admonitions about mixing races. Right? Don't don't fall in love with a black person. Don't have sex with a black person if you're white. And white people or black people shouldn't have sex with white people. What the hell's going on with Sarah or Sally then? Well, I imagine, and I'm kind of trying to put myself in his shoes. I imagine that he was telling himself, well, she's half white, so she's all right. This ridiculous dichotomy that you're drawing about humanity, and it's not he. This is what I mean by him being a man of his time. I've often, as a thought experiment, if you really want to understand what life was like back then, and the viewpoints, these hypocritical viewpoints that many of these people had, right, that lived at this time. And there's something else that was pointed out, which was Thomas Jefferson, for a Virginian, was considered very, very progressive. For Virginia, the society that he was part of, all right, he was considered the liberal. Right? He had progressive ideas about letting freeing the blacks, right, and so forth. In comparison to the people who thought that black people in Virginia, the average viewpoint is that they're no different than cattle, just maybe a little smarter, but not by much. And so there was this mentality didn't exist. So I came up with a thought experiment to try and get people to understand. All right, for if you want to understand the viewpoint, take away all modern knowledge, all right, that we have today, and try to justify and argue with yourself why black people and white people are either inherently better or inherently worse, or inherently inferior, rather. Shouldn't say the word worse. Inferior, right? Argue those points back and forth in your mind without relaying anything that is considered modern knowledge or knowledge outside of that time frame. And you'll quickly start to understand some things, because if you try to take up the side of the people who say that they're inferior, right, it becomes quite easy to do. And if you wonder what I'm talking about, it's very simple. One of the things you can look at right now is go, okay, well, why didn't they build a society? Why are the Africans that are being captured and sent over here, why are they still living as tribes? Why haven't, I mean, if all the people came, if they're the same race and everything's the same, how come they didn't build civilizations? Now, what's your response to that? Are you going to come back and say, well, they did build civilizations? Where? Show us where. Remember, you can't use the modern view or the modern discoveries of these large cities throughout Africa, all right, to come back and say, okay, yeah, well, here was a major civilization, right? You can't come back and go, well, look at Egypt. Well, I hate to tell you this, but most people, even today, still think of Egyptians as not being black. And to an extent, they're not. I mean, they're Arabic, but they ignore the whole fact of the Southern Nile, all right, region. But I'm not going to go into that. But even today, they have that view. That's today's view. Back then, they didn't even have that anything like that. So if you're going to try and argue whether or not a race is inferior or superior, right? Arguing from the standpoint of, well, our civilization, look what we were able to create. These other people didn't create any of this. They're next to dirt. And if you come back and go, well, what about the Native Americans then? They didn't have cultures. They didn't have this. Yes, that's very true, except for one thing. Native Americans, okay, when they were captured and sold into slavery, refused to work and died. Okay? Those that were kept in slavery. The other problem, of course, with capturing a Native American and keeping him as a slave or her as a slave was the fact that when you turned your back, they could run into the woods and they would be fine. This is one of the reasons why Africans were imported as slaves into America, because they didn't know how to live off the land, but the Native Americans did. And so the viewpoint between a lot of white people in that time frame was, well, the natives are inferior as well, but the natives are still superior to black people. This was the view. They were creating these little hierarchies in their minds. And this was the view of people like Thomas Jefferson. I'm not trying to justify this, folks. I'm just telling you, there are men in a world in that time. And when he wrote the Declaration of Independence and he signed the Declaration of Independence, he was signing, all right, his arrest warrant. This was all very true. All right. When he signed the Declaration of Independence, just like John Hancock, all right, he was going to be target number one. He's going to be on the target list. And when it became known that he was the one that wrote it, well, the Brits were pretty much, hunting his ass down. Right? Now, the British never do things to Jefferson that they did to some people, right? Like, for example, what they did to John Hancock. Well, they seized a lot of John Hancock's property and even burned several of his buildings. Okay, it's not like the British, if they really didn't desire it, couldn't have traveled to Monticello. Now, Monticello is a little deeper in Virginia. It's not exactly on the coast, right? But they could have marched to Monticello and burned it to the ground, right? But Virginia was kind of was very anti-British. The thing that people don't understand is the Virginia was very anti-British. The Virginia was also where, quite frankly, you had the Bacon Rebellion, which I talked about last week, right? And so their fear of a slave rebellion, right, permeates even this time frame, right? There's references to this, and so here's Thomas Jefferson saying that his initial proposal was to commute slavery, pay the slave owners or a amount of money, but because blacks were inferior, he didn't want them in the country. He was going to deport them all. Right? He was literally going to say, okay, after we give you monetization for the slaves, we're going to kick you out of the country, and we're going to make sure that we deport you to either back to Africa or more likely to the Caribbean. Which, okay, how are you going to do that? The amount of the sheer number of people that you're talking about, and to try and create that kind of a enforced immigration. Now people are like, well, they did it to they did it to the Cherokee. Different time, different elements, and you're talking fewer people. This is something people don't understand. So Jefferson, when he goes over to France, he really doesn't have any kind of notable success over there. All right, and the reason for this is quite simply that the man himself was good, all right, in writing. He was good, talking one-on-one. But as far as an expressive speaker and a forceful speaker and anything like that, he just didn't have those kind of chops. Right? He returns to the United States. He runs for the presidency. All right, is defeated by John Quincy Adams. Right now, what's interesting is one of his big foes. All right, is obviously Alexander Hamilton, but not just Alexander Hamilton. You're going to ask a question?
No, I'm just chuckling at some of the things that were said between those two. Sorry about that.
They were one thing that became quite interesting was, you got to remember, Hamilton was an industrialist. Okay, he wanted to create industry. He wanted America to industrialize, what we call industrialize, to start going into manufacturing, right? To increase manufacturing, to become where it is, right? Part of the market class. Jefferson is the genteel class. He thinks that these people are scum. He thinks these people are charlatans, right? He at the same time, he recognizes, all right, the contributions, right, by people like Hamilton to the revolution, but on a personal level, he thinks that he's wrong with the direction that these people are going to take the country. Okay. He gets back into politics, though, mainly because of the Constitution. Like I said, he runs for president. He is defeated. He becomes the vice president under John Quincy Adams. He he creates a standard which quickly people recognize was impossible, which is the president of the United States was elected president, but the vice president would be the one who got the second most electoral votes, right? Well, if that's your main opponent, then your main opponent can turn into, can do things to undercut your administration, right? This is one of the reasons why the Constitution was rewritten, right? so that the vice president was not selected as the second person who got the person who got the second most vote. For example, can you imagine Trump being the vice president right now? Right, with Biden as the president. So, but Jefferson was vice president, and he was not a loyal man as far as that goes. Right, he did undercut John a number of times. He runs for presidency again. All right, after the 4-year tour, and wins the presidency and becomes the third president of the United States. Now, as the third president of the United States, what's he known for? Right? Well, he's known for two things, and both of them are significant in American history. Right? First, he's known for the Louisiana Purchase. Okay. Now, why was the Louisiana Purchase important? Right? People don't, they purchased all this land from Napoleon and so forth and blah blah blah. Okay, there's a lot there, right? But there's one thing that people don't understand about the American when America was founded. All right, and what was going on, and what I mean by that is they failed to recognize what the British were doing, because the British were interfering. The British were doing everything they could to prevent the colonies from expanding. In fact, they were funneling weapons and arms to the Native Americans, right? And doing what they could to create, all right, distrust and open warfare, all right, between the colonists, as they still looked at us, and you could still have even Jensen jokes around calling us colonials to this day, right? They were.
I like the way you think I'm joking. Sorry, you carry on.
You think it's just a matter of time before we rejoin you sooner or later?
Well, with the way things are going, we do have an open door policy for you.
So anyway, the thing is that the British were really fomenting a lot of problems, especially on the borders, on the edges. Right. So the Louisiana Purchase was done in a large part as a preemptive method of sealing that area of the nation away from easy interdiction by the British. It's also one of the reasons why you have the expedition under Andrew Jackson down into Florida, okay? Because to stop the British arming the Native Americans and then fomenting warfare, open warfare between the Native Americans and the settlers / colonists, right? But the one thing this did do is this gave the head of the Mississippi River, all right, to the United States and put it directly under there. Now, this was a major thoroughfare. This gave you access to the hinterlands and so forth. So the Louisiana Purchase, all right, did a lot of things. It also removed for all intents and purposes, it pretty much removed the vast majority of European influence onto the continental U.S., within the continental U.S. Yeah, you still had Britain, but as long as they stayed on the other side of the Great Lakes, it wasn't a big issue. It becomes a big issue later on, but this isn't a big issue at this point, right? The other thing that he did is we went to war with the Barbary pirates. Now, while he was the ambassador, right, in France for the 5 years that he was there, I believe it was 5 years, he had attempted to get the Europeans, right, to deal with these guys, to go in there and do a coordinated effort against the Barbary pirates. And they refused, of course, because the British understood something and the French understood something. Their merchants had the capital, all right, to pay these ridiculous, to pay the pirates off. They had the money to pay the pirates off. So anybody that was trying to compete with them, if you didn't have the money to pay for them, well, you couldn't compete. So you couldn't compete in international trade. It was a barrier to international trade. And as a result, we go to war with the Barbary pirates, right? Which is one of the reasons why in the Marine Corps hymn you have them saying the shores of Tripoli, because we raid and we attack, and there are some interesting anecdotes about the raids of the Barbary pirates that the United States engaged in, and put an end to their piracy on U.S. shipping. And they were successful. So Thomas Jefferson is a very complicated man, all right? But like I said, he's a very quiet, personally, he's a very quiet, unassuming individual. He's not a firebrand, okay? He's not going out there leading the charge, and he was not, and I know people don't like to hear this, he was not a leader of men. He was not a Thomas Paine type of character that was willing to put up and shut up, all right? He was far more pragmatic, all right? He was a visionary. He wanted an exposition of individual rights, and he pushed for that. But at the same time, did he free the slaves? No. Now, a lot of people have claimed that he was a horn dog and slept with every freaking, everything under the sun, right? No. But by the same token, did he sleep around on his wife? Probably, right? Because that was the standard back then, right? Especially men of wealth, you were expected to have a mistress or two, right? He himself was not I don't know if you could really describe him that he himself thought of himself as a Christian, all right? He was definitely not a Puritan, right? In any way, shape, or form. The thing that describes him probably the best is a deist, all right? He did not believe in, I don't think believed in the divinity of Christ. I think he did believe, all right, however, that there was a God and there was natural laws that God had issued, which was, of course, used once again to justify his views on slavery, all right, and not releasing the slaves. There was also another problem with that actually Washington struggled with probably more than Jefferson did when it comes to freeing the slaves. Right? If you have a paternalistic mindset, right, toward your family and toward your quote unquote slaves, if you have a paternalistic mindset, then you feel like you've got a social obligation for those that were under your charter or under your house, all right, to succeed, for them to live a better life, okay? If you just free them and say that they're free, are they going to inherit, in and of itself, live a better life? Are they just going to be fed to the wolves? Are you just throwing them out of the house? Remember, if you got a paternalistic mindset, if you're just throwing your child away, I'm not justifying this. Don't get me wrong. That's why I said that and sometimes people forget that a mindset is as a mindset can trap you into a mentality, even if it's that we can't recognize today. Excuse me. It's one of the things I talk about the emperor of Japan during World War II, in the lead up to World War II. The emperor, all right, was as trapped with the social mindset as his people were. Theoretically, he had the ability to make war, and theoretically, he could come out and could have said, look, we're not going to war with the United States. Look, we're not going to do this. Theoretically, he could do that. But mentally, the mental framework within which he had closed off these options for a series of reasons that made sense as he viewed the world that he lived in. And it's that world, when you close yourself off, that you run, that's very difficult to get out of. Now, with Thomas Jefferson, he is in that world, obviously, but the one thing that people can't keep coming back to and keep trying to understand is, well, then how the hell was he able to break free to the point where he wrote the Declaration of Independence? That he wrote these words of all men are created equal. And it was his words. Where individuals, the right of the individual must be maintained, right? He was a big proponent of individual rights. He was a big proponent of the separation of church and state. Everybody that talks about the separation of church and state in the United States owes a debt to the founding father, Thomas Jefferson, because it was him and his push, all right, for it, specifically in the legislature in Virginia, that leads to that concept. No one else was really pushing it at that time. So another one of the reasons why they considered Thomas Jefferson a progressive for that time frame, because he was out of step with that. Later on, he dies, of course, like all these old men. He dies on July 4th, right? Independence Day, just a few hours before John Adams dies. Now, John Adams, during the colonial period, right, and Jefferson got along fabulously. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were boon companions to a point. Later on, they become, like I said, mortal enemies. But that has less to do with Thomas Jefferson, what Thomas Jefferson did, than with the fiery personality that John Adams was. John Adams was a zealot in that regard, right? And that it's hard to, with some people, it's hard to get that understanding of John Adams and how arrogant, how demanding, all right, John Adams could be, all right. But at the same time, like like all people, right, he's got good points and bad points, like he's got good things you can say about him and bad things you can say about him. But one of the things he was zealous, and he was a zealot, a patriot, to the point where he looks at a lot of the things that Jefferson is trying to do later on, and he recognizes the aristocratic, authoritarian nature of the man, all right, when it comes to certain policies, specifically Jefferson's opposition to manufacturing and the establishment of factories, all right, like textiles and things like that in the United States. That's Thomas Jefferson. That's who he was. It's a time frame that he lived in, right? Is there anything you want to add to this, Jeff?
Yeah, just a tiny point. It's not a shock that he's not well liked by the modern political attitude, and I'm trying to word that very, very carefully. I hope you notice. After all, as you said, technically he is quite progressive, but to these people, he would be considered possibly one step below Satan, and that isn't actually a joke as much as I wish it was.
Oh no, that's very true. All right, there very much is a an accurate assessment of today's time frame because they don't want to learn from history. Right? You don't look at why this guy. Okay, why should Thomas Jefferson be remembered? Okay, well, why should the Declaration of Independence be remembered? Right? If you're going to make that comment, then you're saying that the Declaration shouldn't be remembered, right? I'm not trying to justify the man's actions, right? I'm just trying to point out that they lived in a different world with a different mindset. It wouldn't surprise me, like I said, where he looked upon his relationship with Sally as more a relationship with a white person who is black. This is what, telling himself that his sexual liaison with her was perfectly acceptable because she wasn't really black, right? That she's more white than black. The quote unquote blackness has been bred out of her, so it's perfectly acceptable, right? Which is just, and I'll say one more thing that's a possibility, and that is, he's also probably looking at it from the standpoint of he knows the hell those children would go through, and they would have, if it became known that he was the father and that he was fathering these children. Yeah, his own standing in society would have taken a hit too, and I'm sure that was uppermost in his mind. Don't get me wrong, right? I'm sure that probably the most important reason why he never admitted to having a relationship with Sally had to do more with the fact that he would take a hit rather than his children. But I'll bet that was how he justified it in his own mind. That he was saving them the pain, he was saving her the pain, because if it became known, they would have been as castigated and ostracized from society as he would be. Now we look at things, we're looking at things, like I said, from the 21st century. They didn't have these options, they didn't have that worldview. And the reason was because the worldview didn't exist yet. Even, like I said, the archaeology, the knowledge or the belief, all right, the theoretical evidence that we have found that humankind or human beings or Homo sapiens, all right, came out of Africa. That concept didn't exist. It wasn't even a thought then. Okay, and we rely upon these things. The archaeological evidence of these ancient civilizations in Africa, and there were several great examples of that they're finding today, right? And that these people were black. I'm going to be real blunt. There's a lot of people that believed that the empire of Timbuktu, right? Back in the day, they had known that there was a fabled city called Timbuktu. They hadn't found any archaeological evidence, but they had read about it from, stories, right?
Yeah.
From stories in the history records. So it was a myth, but nobody at that point had found Timbuktu. So that ancient civilization of Timbuktu, it may have existed, but it was like Atlantis. They were white too, right? We have no idea. We have no idea, of course, whether the Atlanteans were white, black, or anything else. All we know is that they were referred to in history, and they're in the ideas of legend, right? Well, when you look around at civilizations back in the 18th century, you saw Asian civilization, you saw white civilization, right? But you didn't see black civilization anywhere. You didn't see Native American civilization aside from the Aztecs, and they needed to go, right, from the way that they looked at the world, right? Yeah. So these ideas of these other civilizations, that wasn't even a concept to them, right? So you can understand when they look around and go, well, look at me versus that person over there. Look at who I am from a social standpoint. And you also got to remember the idea of individuals being equal wasn't normal.
would
Okay.
point out that the reason we couldn't find anything about black civilization was, after all, everybody nowadays knows about Wakanda. They just hid it from us. That's all it was. So I had to. It was sitting there waiting for that joke.
Jensen. There are a number of Bathsheba, right? Was probably black. Right. We know from the Roman from the Roman histories, right, and actually from Roman archaeology, right, that there were several, all right, African black Nubians, right. The Nubians were black. They weren't Carthaginians, right. They were black, right. They were from the continent, all right. We know that today because the archaeological record shows that. You didn't have that back then. That wasn't a widespread understanding of the world back then. So these people are handcuffed. These people are hamstrung with the world that they're living within, right? And if you grow up in a household that has slaves, these were the people you interacted with every day. You were considered the master, right? You were being told, yes, master, you're the master. And you're being educated that as a master, you are responsible for your servants. You're being educated this way. You're being told this. Why? Can you realize how difficult it would be to step outside of that? Look, even the Egyptians were considered black, but the latest findings show that there weren't these weren't African blacks. I disagree with you. Right? If you take a look at the archaeological record, all right, especially if you look at the difference between the Blue Nile and the White Nile, all right, you can see the difference, all right. But the southern area of the Nile, the southern Egypt, all right, they're African. You can see it in the archaeological record, okay, from the standpoint. Yes, stylistically they're Egyptian, but if you take a look at the facial characteristics and also the hair characteristics, it's obvious, right, that they were black. And what you see, I think, in Egypt more than anything else is actually what happens when different races have for a long time have interacted together. Right? You have people with dark skin, but they don't have the kinky hair. They don't have the kinky hair. They have straighter hair. Right? I just think that's a natural consequence of man. Right? It's not saying that people. I'm not trying to justify anything. I'm just saying in the archaeological record of the Southern Nile, you do. It's obvious that that most of them were black. You can look at the Egyptians as far as the Arabic Egyptians go, and you can say, well, they're white. Okay, well, if you want to use that term, I think that they're Arabic. I think they're it's a what's the word that looks Semitic? They're a Semitic population. Yeah. Right. Which obviously the Jews from that time frame also have that context, right? The other thing about the Jews today, though, I mean, let's be honest. What's the Jews look like today? They call many Jewish people today. They go back to a heritage, and one of the characteristics is that nose, right? The one that the big hook nose that the people always point to. Well, how many people in America have big noses? Do they have Jewish roots? Do they have Semitic roots? I think it's very possible. I think they're just certain aspects of genetics. That's just the way the world is. You know. I don't think it has anything to do with your intelligence. I don't think it has anything to do with your civilization. I think the main reason why you don't see most African civilizations lasting for any length of time has to do with changes that happen in the environment, all right, over time. And the fact that starting a civilization or restarting a civilization is much more difficult in a jungle, all right, than it is in a temperate zone. simply from an agricultural standpoint. It's very difficult. Agriculture is very difficult in a jungle environment, right? That's just reality, right? And if you wonder why I say that, okay, it goes back to something about jungles. What are jungles? Well, jungles are where there's a lot of trees, a lot of humidity, a lot of growth, and there's a lot of animals.
Yeah.
Right? Well, what does that equate to? Food. There's a lot of food all around you. All right. Yeah, the jungle is a lot of these things are poisonous, and there's people that are trying to kill you, and the diseases are trying to kill you. That's all true. But the one thing you don't hear about very often is in a jungle environment, people starving to death, unless they were from a different, unless they grew up somewhere else and didn't know where to look for food. Because food is relatively plentiful in every single tropical zone. Why? Because it grows there. You're more likely to die of a disease than you are of starvation. Well, look at where outbreaks of famine occur. Do you see it? Have you heard of an outbreak of famine, okay, in the Congo? Well, you heard of diseases from the Congo. You heard of Ebola from the Congo. But you don't hear about starvation in the Congo. Why is that? Well, it's very simple. Because there's food. There's ready access to food. And when you have ready access to food, you don't have as much pressure on your society, all right, to learn to grow, to store food, to engage in agriculture. It's one of the reasons why in agriculture, if you really want to look at it, they can point to things like the Mesopotamian Valley. One of the main reasons why the Mesopotamian Valley happened is because, yeah, you have the ability to grow food there, but a few miles east or west, and you're dealing in sand. Okay? So these things are important. In America, North America, why do you not see, quite frankly, why do you not see Native Americans really engaging in agriculture? Right? People can point out that, well, they did grow grains and they grew and taught the pilgrims corn and things like that. Yeah, it's kind of the beginnings, but there's not you don't have big storage bins being put up in these areas. The reason, quite frankly, is that food is relatively plentiful. Where do you see massive civilizations happening in the Americas is down south in Latin America, specifically in Mexico, where once again, you have, this area has water and food, but these other areas just a few miles north and a few miles east, it's pretty much desert. So it's just the vagaries of society. You going to say something, Jensen?
Yeah, I do know one fact that may be connected with this gentleman. Now, if I'm wrong, I'm going to make myself look like a right idiot here. But you were detailing his house earlier. Now, in his house, he has a tomb for him and his family. Do you know about this?
Okay, go on.
Who's buried there?
No idea.
Not him. Even though it's got his name and all of that on the plaques, he is not actually buried there. Apparently, nobody knows where he's buried. He is.
It's very possible. You got to remember something about this time frame. You know, he's trying to create a mausoleum for himself, right, and his family, right. Mm-hmm. But when you become a figure of note in the United States, your wishes when you die, quite frankly, aren't necessarily adhered to.
Fair.
Mm-hmm. So it's when you become a figure outside of, outside of yourself, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
There are several figures in America that are like that. Right? Obviously, George Washington is one of them. Right? The Washington Monument is there dedicated to Washington, but Is Washington buried there? No, right? Um, so these in America as a whole, for whatever reason, we didn't create mausoleums where people would go to the dead person's grave to memorialize them. Right? If they were there are other things people point to as a memorial rather than the actual tomb. And this is true in Britain as well, right? I mean, Trafalgar Square, for example, right? Nelson, people that are fans of Nelson go to Trafalgar Square, right?
Yeah. I know where you're
So,
going with this, but yes, I agree.
yeah, it's just an interesting, aspect of I think that from our Western culture. Whereas this is different, right, than, for example, Napoleon, and so forth. Yeah, people point to the Arc of Triomphe and stuff, so forth, but provoke MC his rage is why I exist. No, but the whole slavery thing with Thomas Jefferson is way overblown, right? Now, as he engages in politics, he becomes basically the founder of what they call the Democrats. The Blue Nile and the racist Nile.
Yeah, the party have been, less than subtle. It's quite entertaining to read some of the things they're saying. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, you got to remember about the difference in the Nile, though, and you talk about the Egyptians. There's different aspects of the Egyptians that people have got to take a look at. The Egyptian culture is quite interesting. That would be an interesting study in and of itself, only because the Egyptians themselves were a very they're a very interesting group of people to begin with, right? Because they were inherently an insular group, all right, that their leadership standards forced them to be expansionist. All right. But it's also due to the fact that there were people to fight. You know what I mean? They were there before there were people to fight, and as people became to fight, then they would have to go out there to try and conquer them. It was kind of they're an interesting.
I will say one thing about the Egyptians. They had the right idea with one thing and one thing only. They knew cats were gods. It's about time that people needed to understand this.
Well, they also they also tamed cheetahs and had cheetahs as pets, which was
yeah.
That's a pretty big kitty.
Kitty. Yes, it was very true though.
But yeah, the Egyptians are we owe a lot to the Egyptians. We owe a lot to a lot of the different civilizations. Okay, they were not the only civilizations. We owe a lot as our people didn't recognize this. We owe a lot to the Phoenicians. We owe a tremendous lot to the Phoenicians that the Phoenicians never get credit for. Right? The one thing about, like I said, with Jefferson is the first one that we've talked about who was formally educated, like I said. He's an educated man. You see it in his writings. You see it in that kind of stuff. But he's also stuck in the society that he grew up in. And like I said, he wasn't. Yeah. He himself, I don't think, was a Christian. I don't think he ever called himself a Christian. Right? He didn't think that he was someone who would look at somebody else and think that he was of a superior breed. And I'm not talking he was seeing the black person or the Native American and saying he was of a superior breed. I'm saying he would look down on those who were not as rich as he was, right? Because they were a lower aspect, a lower strata of society. And one of the things that we that happens in America is the Democrat Party, the Democrats, that they basically he founds the Democrat Party. He founded that aspect of America. And it is his party that gets taken over, okay, by Jackson later on. And Jackson is is not the same kind of man, okay, that Thomas Jefferson is. Thomas Jefferson was representing landowners and farmers and things like that, but he wasn't necessarily interested in representing the populace, a popular uprising, a popular movement. He wasn't involved. He never looked at it like from that standpoint. He did consider himself a progressive, but it was a progressive as Virginia. Now, Virginia was very, very much a different society than the rest of any of the other colonies, and that's things that people forget about. Right? The colonies themselves were miniature societies in and of themselves, which is why the colonists often fought amongst themselves. And he was, but he looked at himself as a superior life form to the people around him, and it's that attitude that alienates several of his good friends. Like, for example, John Adams. John Adams begins to absolutely hate that mindset of his.
Just want to respond to Shirati. They don't die, hun. They just return back to the mothership. They're just getting rid of their mortal bodies. Something people need to understand. Carry on, sir. Just wanted to respond to her.
The 9 lives of cats, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's Thomas Jefferson. You got anything else you want to say? I think I've beaten Thomas Jefferson to death.
Personally, I like the idea of beating him to death, but I'm fairly confident as an American you're probably against that idea. But as I've said, the whole thing with the War of Independence with the Americans, I truly believe it was a stupid thing that the British did. It really was. Things would have been so much more interesting if we could have worked something out. Simply put, like you said, a lot of the problems, Parliament, and of course the fact that King George was not on the same plane as anybody else. Truly, that man was, well, you like to take the mickey out of the various drunken people. I'm not looking at Skeletor here, and I'm definitely not saying her name was a drunkard, but, we take the mickey out of her, but yet, dear old King George, his grip on reality was at best questionable, and that is me being as polite as I possibly can.
Well, yeah, but he was a Hanover, and you guys brought back after you went in your little recital freaking rant with Cromwell.
I never said it was a good thing, did I? And Cromwell was a bad idea. His level of bad is truly outstanding. But I completely agree with you.
That would be an interesting discussion one day to talk about Cromwell. I'd like to, because I think the American viewpoint of Cromwell and the British would do different things.
Yes. Now, you actually need to change something there. The English attitude towards Cromwell and the Irish attitude towards Cromwell. To say that they are ever so slightly different is somewhat akin to suggesting that moonlight isn't quite sun. Okay? Seriously, Irish despise Cromwell. I can't put it across enough. I don't actually think America has come close to how much, when it comes to a hatred level, that they have for this person.
Americans don't hate Cromwell.
No, not just Cromwell. So I'm talking. I don't think America actually has any particular person. Actually, I will use a modern term. The Irish hate Cromwell the same way as the left hate Trump. Does that make sense?
I can believe that.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
let me ask you a question: do the Scots hate
Yeah.
Cromwell the same way?
The Scots hate everybody, including their
Oh.
most hated enemy, the Scots. Okay.
Okay.
Seriously, don't waste your time with these people. They will go to the war at the drop of a hat, and if you don't drop your hat, you're obviously a heretic. Let's go to war with them. Okay. I'm sorry. I don't think you guys have exactly the friendliest attitude towards the Canadians either, but trust me, Britain and Scotland. Oh, Scotland's lovely. Shame about Scottish. Okay.
Yeah, no, it would be an interesting discussion, but that's all I have for Thomas Jefferson right now. What
No
do you
problem.
what do you want to? Well, I will say one last thing, right? That's very important.
Yeah.
Okay, from a democratic standpoint, you don't become a democratic society. You don't truly have a democratic society, right? Until the other side wins an election and it's recognized. Okay, you can talk about the one party system in America today all you want, right? But if you have a single party mindset, the other party never wins, and there's been examples of that throughout history. Right, the most glaring example, believe it or not, that most people don't even recognize, is Mexico. It wasn't until just a few years ago, all right, that someone aside from the PRI won an election, won the national election, and was sworn in as the president of the country. So that's almost 100
Okay.
years of single party rule for that nation, right? Now, has it changed anything? Well, there's other aspects of that society that are obviously problematic, but you don't have a working democracy until the other side is able to win elections, because the one side is corrupt. Power corrupts. That's the reality. If you have a single party in charge of everything, they're going to become corrupt. Of course, that's the part of the problem right now is these people have been in charge too long. All right, but Thomas Jefferson represented that, all right, within 12 years. Within 12 years of the Constitution in America, you have someone from the opposition party winning the election and being installed as the president of the United States. That's another reason why Thomas Jefferson is very important. Not necessarily for the Revolutionary War, but for the America to begin as a democracy, as a republic, as a democratic republic. That's all I wanted to say.
I have to say, I did not know he actually created the Democrats. That is interesting, I've got to say.
Yeah, the Democrat
Well,
Party basically
next
traces the
week.
roots.
Okay,
What was that?
cool. Next week, what do we think? Hamilton.
You want to go over Alexander Hamilton? the,
I
the,
kind of
the,
think if we're doing one side, we should do the other. You know.
okay. And when we will talk about Thomas Jefferson's vice president in that regard.
No problem.
Well, the vice president under Thomas Jefferson was Aaron Burr. We're going to talk about Aaron Burr a little bit. We probably should do a story on Aaron Burr by himself. Right? There's two.
I'll be honest, I've never heard of the guy. Okay, I'm going to seriously never heard of the dude. I've heard of a lot of these other names, but this guy, no.
There's reasons for that, and it's not just because he shot Hamilton in a duel.
He'd be more famous then, wouldn't you?
He was a at the time frame he was a well-known member of the colonial period, and he was a patriot until he wasn't. So we probably should talk about it. But
Shirati seems rather surprised that we're doing Burr. Just letting you know.
Yeah, he's an interesting figure in American history, right? For a variety of reasons. But Alexander Hamilton next week, okay, that's fine. We'll do Alexander Hamilton.
Yeah.
And, talk about who he was and his upbringing. He was a bit uniquely American in a lot of ways. Right? So. Yeah, well, the reality is, Sharardi, is that most Americans only know that Aaron Burr shot Hamilton in a duel. Okay, and Alexander Hamilton died in the duel. And we need to talk a little bit about dueling. Because technically, when they fought that duel, it was illegal, but it was. Dueling was, a different aspect. Well, we need to talk. Well, so we'll talk about dueling in the different forms and what it became about. All right, dueling was very, very much different than what people would think today. Dueling was about. And the reasons behind it, and society behind it, and the whole context behind it, and so forth. So, but Alexander Hamilton sounds good.
Okay then. In that case, thank you for coming out, ladies and gentlemen, and again, whatever else you want to call yourself. I hope you learnt something, because I know full well I did. So, hopefully see you next week. See you then, people. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming out.